All right, so today's math goal, please write it down in your math notebook, is the math properties to compute mental math. So write down anything you remember about some of the math properties. And if you don't remember anything about the math properties, just simply write down, that you don't remember anything. Okay, so a couple of the math properties are the commutative property and the associative properties. So let's start by talking about the commutative property of addition. Okay, so the commutative property of addition, write this one down. I like to think of as commutative, commuting, change. So what do you do when you commute? You move around from place to place. So the commutative property tells me changing the order of the addends does not change the sum. So my example, A plus B using my variables is the same thing as B plus A. So an example of that, I can add 2 plus 3 is going to give me 5, or I can change the addend order. I can do 3 plus 2 and it's still going to give me 5. So changing the order does not matter. So write that one down. Commutative, changing the order does not matter. Okay, so because of the commutative property of addition, tells me the order doesn't matter, I could simply solve this problem, right? If I have 17 and 39 hundredths plus 12 and 58 hundredths equals 12 and 50 hundredths plus n, I can very easily solve for n because I know that the order doesn't matter. And if I have this one here, I can use my little rainbow bars. So what's going to be n? N has to be 17 and 39 hundredths because the order doesn't matter. I can switch them around. All right, the associative property. So the associative property tells of addition, write this one down also, by the way, tells me that changing the grouping of the addends does not change the sum. So now we're doing groups. So when I group things together, I like to group them to make it easier to add. So my example, my variables A plus B equals C. I could do A plus B equals C. I can group them like that, or I can group them with B plus C, and it doesn't matter. Let me give you an example. If A was 1 and B was 2 and C was 3, I could group 1 plus 2 together to give me 3, and 3 plus 3 makes 6. Or I can group the 2 and the 3 together to give me 5 plus the 1 is 6. It's still going to be 6. And remember that whatever's in parentheses, you do that first. In this example, this is in parentheses. I would add the 1 and the 2 first, and then add the 3. In this instance, I would add the 2 and the 3 first, and then add the 1. So parentheses go first. All right. All right, so let's try one. So how can we use the properties to add these numbers? So don't let these numbers overwhelm you, because really we're just going to be looking at groupings. What can I group together to add to make it faster to add? Okay, so pause the video for a moment, see if you can think of any numbers you can group together to make it easier to add, and then come back to me. All right, so I use the associative property to group these together. So I did 50,000 plus 50,000. I got my 50,000 and 50,000, grouped those two together. Then I grabbed my 25,000 and my 75,000, and I grouped those two together. And then I left my 38,000 alone. So as you can see, my 50,000 and 50,000 is going to give me 100,000. My 25,000 and 75,000 is also going to give me 100,000. Plus my 38,000, I can simply add 100,000 plus 100,000 in my mind. I know that's 200,000 plus a 38,000 gives me 238,000. Much easier to do mentally, right, than having to write it all, line them all up, and solving. All right, so try this one. I forgot to write that down on this one, right? Try this one. So try this one and see if you can use the commutative property or associative property to figure out how to group these together to quickly add it mentally without having to do the math. Don't let the numbers throw you off. Look to see what they have in common and try it and see what you get, and then come back to me. Okay, so I grouped like denominators, right? So I saw 2 and 4 fifths, and then I saw the 1/5. I grouped those two together. Then I saw the fourths. So I grouped those together, the 3/4 plus the 1/4, and I left my 5/7. So I used my associative property to group these. So 2 and 4/5 and a fifth. So 4/5 and 1/5 makes a whole. So 2 plus 1 is 3. 3/4 and a fourth, right, makes one whole. So that gives me 3 plus 1 plus the 5/17. 3 plus 1 is 4, so it's 4 and 5/17. All right, we're going to look at one more property, the distributive property of addition. What do you remember about the distributive property? Do you remember anything? Stop and pause for a moment and see if you remember anything about the distributive property. All right, write this down. The distributive property tells me I can distribute the numbers to make it easier to compute. So in my example here, I have A times B plus C. So what this is telling me, I can change my numbers around. I can distribute the numbers to make it easier to add. So I can distribute it, the A times the B plus the A times the C. Let me give you an example of that. Okay, in my example here, I made A1, B a 2, and C a 3. So then I just rewrote A was a 1, B was a 2, and A still my 1, and C is my 3. So C in parentheses, where I got to do parentheses first, 2 plus 3 is 5. So it leaves me with a 1 times 5, which is 5. Parentheses, 1 times 2 is 2. Parentheses, 1 times 3 is 3. Add them together, 2 plus 3 is 5. It's the same, right? I just distributed it to make it a little bit easier. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, so in this example, I have 7 times 75 plus 7 times 25. So I'm going to distribute these. So what do these numbers have in common? So you see, I have a 7 in common here in both. So I can take out my 7 and I can multiply it by 25 times plus 75. So if I do 25 plus 75, that's going to give me 100. So it's 7 times 100, which is 700. So I'm just distributing them out. In this case, I'm putting it back in to get my answer. So I'm looking for something that they have in common to be able to do that. All right, so use the distributive property to solve. So you try one. 800 times 9 plus 200 times 9. See what they have in common. See what you can distribute to figure that one out. So pause the video and write this one down and see, and then come back to me. All right, so you can see they have in common. What do they have in common? They have this 9 in common. They both have a 9. So I took out the 9. Then I can simply add the 800 plus the 200, which is 1,000. So then it'd be 9 times 1,000, which is 9,000. So that's the distributive property. All right, so write down one thing that you learned, or write down a few things that you learned, right? Because we talked about 3 properties. So write down what you learned. Do a proof of learning by solving a problem similar to the ones that were on the video. If you have a reflection or a question, please note that down in your math notebook.